So that's the first. But there is another layer that most Americans are not aware of, but much of the rest of the world is highly aware of, and that is a religious layer. Now, Lindsey Graham is on tape saying to a gaggle of reporters, his bloodshot eyes, his puffy face, God knows what he's been doing, saying explicitly, this is a religious war. This is a religious war. Now, his motive in saying that, he's not here to answer the question. We can only guess. Is he trying to foment a religious war? Probably. He's an end times kind of guy. But it almost doesn't matter. He's telling the truth for once. This is a religious war, fundamentally. And that is not obvious to most Americans because this is the most secular society, not just the United States, but the West, the English-speaking world, Europe and the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand. In history, there's never been a more godless, to be blunt about it, a more secular society at scale. Never. Nothing approaching this has ever happened, ever. Every society is fundamentally a religious society, explicitly religious except ours. So we lack the terms to describe what we're seeing, and we lack the imagination to think about it. And, well, to quote Jesus, we have the eyes, but we cannot see. We don't see what's happening around us, but the rest of the world very much does see. So you often hear people talk about the Middle East crisis, and they usually mean energy. People want the oil, the gas. But traditionally, when people have talked about the Middle East, they're talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about the holiest spot on earth. Let's be a lot more specific when we say the holiest spot on earth. The holiest spot on earth is something called the foundation stone. The foundation stone is literally a rock in Jerusalem on what used to be called Mount Moriah, which was at one point the highest place in the oldest part of Jerusalem. And it's on that spot, on that rock, on that stone, that Jews believe the world began, that the Old Testament, or the Jewish Torah, tells us that Abraham brought Isaac bound to be sacrificed to God. It's on that spot that Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven. And of course, it's right nearby that Christians believe Jesus was crucified and then rose to heaven. So on that spot, or right nearby, a lot has happened. But critically on that spot, because it was the place where Abraham brought Isaac, and again, to American ears, this sounds weird, but to the rest of the world, it's like, yeah, everyone knows this because it's the center of their lives. On that spot, Solomon built his famous temple. Now, in the Torah, it says pretty clearly, and correct me if I'm misreading it, that Jews, followers of God, can only publicly worship God and sacrifice on that spot, in that city, Jerusalem, on that spot. And on that spot was built a temple, the first temple. And that was destroyed by the Babylonians, famously. And then it was rebuilt and later improved by Herod. And it was, at its completion, I think, the largest building, certainly the largest religious building in the ancient world. And it was in that building that Jesus preached, in what we call the Second Temple that Jesus preached, the very center of Judaism, building without which you can't really have Torah Judaism. The religion just sort of didn't work without it. By its own terms, in its own book, it said that. And during one of his sermons, in that sermon, Jesus, who Christians believe is God sent to earth, says, this will be torn down. Not one stone will be left standing. And it was shortly after that that he was put on trial in the middle of the night and tortured to death, crucified. As it happens, so that's the religion. Here's the history. About 35 years later, 37 years later, in that range, in 70 AD, Titus, the emperor of the Roman Empire, got into quite a conflict with the Jews of Judea and Jerusalem. And it's complex and incredibly brutal, but the bottom line was, in AD 70, the Romans besieged Jerusalem, finally broke through the walls, and tore that temple stone from stone, not a single stone left upon another. Really a kind of dedication to destruction that's hard for the modern mind to imagine. We talk about genocide, genocide that. The Romans tried to genocide the Jews for real. And they succeeded in destroying the temple. And with it, Temple Judaism, Torah Judaism. You can't have the religion that existed before AD 70, after AD 70, because there's no temple. And so this has been an open wound for 2,000 years, and certainly understandably, people have wanted to rebuild the temple, to build what they call the third temple, to reestablish this religion at its birthplace. There are a couple problems with this. One, exactly 500 years after Titus destroyed the temple in AD 70, in AD 570, a man called Muhammad was born in Mecca and built one of the world's great religions, the world's second largest religion, as it stands today, in a very short period. His name was Muhammad. He was born in Mecca. He died in nearby Medina. But in the meantime, he built or inspired the building of, within 50 years of his death, one of the great religious monuments in the world, certainly one of the prettiest, called the Dome of the Rock. And it's in Jerusalem on Moriah, in fact, built over the foundation stone. And if you've ever been to Jerusalem, or if you've ever seen photographs of it, you will remember vividly a gold dome. It's called the Dome of the Rock. Why is it called that? Because there's a rock underneath it, the foundation stone, that is built on the site of the Second Temple. And that's in what's known as the Al-Aqsa complex. There's a mosque next door called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that spot is one of three holy places, apparently co-equal holy places, in Islam: Mecca, Medina, Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa. So that is at the very center of Judaism. I mean, physically the center of Judaism, that spot, that exact spot over the foundation stone, and Islam. And it has been occupied by a mosque. A mosque has been sitting there since the 7th century, since the late 600s. Amazing. You may be dimly aware of this. Now, why go on at length about this? Because now is the moment, right now, like this week, is the moment that some people, not a huge number, most people, Christians, Jews, Muslims, are not fully aware of all this, but some people are highly aware of it and would like to begin the process of tearing down the Dome of the Rock, tearing down Al-Aqsa Mosque, and rebuilding the Third Temple. Now, there are a lot of things to say about this, about its likelihood, the potential effects of it. But first, just a quick side note on the theology of this from a Christian point of view. Now, it was Jesus who said this temple will be torn down, shocking everyone around him. If it's in the Gospels, it's in at least a couple of the Gospels. And the people who heard it just couldn't believe it. And of course, the people running the temple, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, were gravely offended by it. Why wouldn't they be? But then it happened. Less than 40 years later, it actually happened. He was right. He called it. And so from a Christian perspective, he did that. God called for the destruction of the temple. And as Jesus says plainly in the Gospels, I'm the temple. I'm the temple now. The temple will be rebuilt after 3 days. When I'm resurrected, I am the new temple. Says that. But there has been at least one attempt in the last 2,000 years to rebuild a physical third temple. And it happened in the 4th century. And it happened, without getting too far afield, shortly after the death of Constantine. Now, Constantine was the 4th century Roman emperor who converted to Christianity and very famously turned the Roman Empire Christian, thereby spreading Christianity basically instantly across the West, where it's remained, more or less, ever since.